Greetings, history buffs. So, there's a lot of great lectures this week from John Green, and I just wanted to chime in and add an idea that a lot of historians have had looking at the New Deal in the 1920s as a social reform movement and a realigning almost of the American political system. So, I just want to go through a couple quick points and reiterate some of what Green said and also add my own twist on things. So, the United States between World War I and the Great Depression was a nation of apparent contradictions. You've read this in Zinn, you've heard it in John Green's lectures, and it's really kind of striking. For instance, we have Eugene Debs, a famous socialist who is sent to jail for declaring that the sun of capitalism is setting and the sun of socialism is rising. He then won over 1 million votes while running for president, and he won these from prison. A year later, the 18th Amendment was passed, which implemented prohibition. Still, the era became to be known as the Jazz Age, an era of speakeasies, slumming, flappers, and kind of this social looseness, right? And in 1920, won the right to vote via the 19th Amendment. Still, mostly white women were the ones who benefited from this amendment. And at the same time, there were anti-suffragist women who claimed that voting would ruin the home, with women being part of politics not being a socially accepted thing. So, in addition to this idea that we've also talked about a lot of how this nation is becoming more and more comprised of immigrants, there's this huge reactionary movement of nativism that's blossoming in the 20s as the KKK, or Ku Klux Klan, found renewed vigor and immigration became even more restricted. Still, there's a younger generation embodied perhaps best by this idea of a flapper that felt freer than ever before. They were leading national commentators to declare it sex o'clock in America. So just two things to keep in mind as we talk about this today is that the contradictions were much more like those found in the Progressive Era reforms that sought to initiate reforms led by white middle-class experts to help order society and limit the inequality in the market system. And after the crash at the end of the business-friendly 1920s, Americans demanded action to address these problems. So looking at World War II and the Red Scare and just kind of going over this really quickly, there is a large influx of returning soldiers from World War I. Importantly, the war was not fought on American soil, and the country entered the war very, very late. So the U.S. was able to retreat to its selectively isolationist shell after the war. Thus, unlike their European brethren, Americans were not affected by war like most of the Europeans. Still, economic depression hit the nation in 1918. After the war, the U.S. rescinded recognition to labor unions that businesses were forced to grant during wartime because they needed the production. They needed workers working. Thus, in 1919, they experienced one of the largest waves of strikes in the history of the United States, roughly around 3,300 strikes. For instance, women telephone operators went on strike throughout New England. Despite opposition from male-dominated leadership of the union, women won several of their demands. But Americans were overall uneasy with this labor activism, especially given the recent immigration of new immigrants and the success of the Russian Revolution. In most cases around the country, businesses and the state crushed most strikes. In 1919, we also saw the resurgence of a lot of race riots. Race riots rocked 24 cities and towns. The worst violence occurred in Chicago, which was a favorite destination for migrating blacks. Beaches were officially segregated there, and when a young black boy drifted over to the white side of a beach on a raft, whites hit him with a stone and he drowned. Rumors spread, tempers flared, and soon whites were sweeping the black sections of the city. Stabbings, burnings, and shootings went on for days until state police restored some calm. 38 people died in total, 23 African Americans and 15 whites. Thus, given all of this overexcitement and all of these things, Americans elected Warren G. Harding in 1920, who essentially ran on a platform of this idea of a return to normalcy, which people were kind of thirsting for at this moment. This idea, when we think about the progressive era of a government, was talking about working on behalf and in cooperation with businesses. And working in cooperation with business on behalf of business is known as associationalism. And this is really what Hoover was at heart. So this idea was very much possible since elite business leaders came out with excellent reputations. Americans kept their faith in these men for the next decade because it was they who had predominantly run the wartime government boards that were very successful. But in associationalism, government still had an interesting role to play, as we see with the Federal Highway Act, which was passed in 1921. The government raised tariff rates on imports, but they didn't want to get in business's way, so courts ruled against the minimum wage laws and the legality of striking workers. Like progressives, associationalism wanted the worker and the corporation to work things out on their own, as if they were two equally powerful individuals. And again, this is a question we can see that workers have agency, but there still are structures in place that are benefiting the employers much more than the workers. At the end of the day, the employers are the ones with the money. Also thinking, again, going back to this idea of nativism, the arrival over the past decades of new immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe helped increase reactionary nativist sentiment across the country. Nativism is a fear of outsiders, and this was expressed as anti-Catholic, anti-Jew, and anti-immigrant. It was also racist in the outlook as it believed in the superiority of what many Americans referred to as the Anglo-Saxon race. We've already read some of these sentiments throughout, or people who are raging against these sentiments, right? These unfair sentiments in our readings. But over the next several decades, this identity would become more based on skin pigmentation, allowing previously excluded immigrants into the folds of whiteness. So the really question would then become one of race. To kind of summarize, one can draw a straight line from increased racial segregation to the arrival of Birth of a Nation, this incredibly racist depiction in a movie, one of the first movies in the United States, to the Red Scare after World War I, to the Immigration Act of 1924, which greatly restricted immigration for the next 40 years. It set a new limit on arrivals, this Immigration Act of 1924, and it was proportional to those already in the country. It favored Europeans from Northern and Western Europe and prohibited immigration from the Middle East and Asia, which is not something necessarily new to the scene, right? Lastly, after the Depression hit, Americans reacted harshly as it officially deported some 80,000 people of Mexican national origin between 1929 and 1935. And it's important to mention that a lot of these Mexican workers were brought in by something known as the Bracero program, which I will try to detail with a little more emphasis in later lectures. But the Bracero program essentially was the United States government bringing in these Mexican laborers to fulfill spots that were vacant in terms of farm labor because of, well, the war and other work that men couldn't do at that time. So interesting thought that, you know, the United States government brought in these workers and also then decided to send them back when there was no more quote-unquote use for them. So anyway, all of this is putting a little more of what John Green talked about into context. Thanks for listening and watching, everyone.